Emily Johnson grew up in a modest but loving home in Accra. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, worked hard to give her the best life they could. Mr. Johnson owned a shop selling household goods and groceries. Her mother, Agnes, was a warm and nurturing woman who ran a sewing business. Emily and her mother were inseparable. Agnes believed in the importance of education and always encouraged Emily to study hard. "You're my star," she would say, pinching Emily's cheek lovingly. "One day, you'll grow up and shine so bright that the world will notice." Their family life wasn't perfect, but it was full of love. Then, everything changed one fateful afternoon. Emily was 16 years old and had just returned home from school. She was working on her homework when her father rushed into the house, his face pale and panicked. "Emily," he said, his voice trembling, "there's been an accident. Your mother." Emily froze, her pencil falling from her hand. "What do you mean? What happened to Mama?" she asked, her voice barely audible. She was in a car crash on her way back from delivering a client's dress," Mr. Johnson said, his eyes filling with tears. Time seemed to stop. Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her mother, the woman who was always so full of life, was now fighting for hers. They rushed to the hospital, but when they arrived, the doctor's expression said it all. "I'm so sorry," he said softly. "We did everything we could, but she didn't make it." Emily's world shattered in that moment. The woman who had been her anchor, her guide, and her greatest cheerleader was gone. The days after the accident were a blur. The house that once echoed with laughter was now silent and cold. Emily spent hours in her mother's sewing room, running her fingers over the fabrics and tools Agnes had used, trying to feel close to her. Mr. Johnson was equally broken, though he tried to stay strong for Emily. He threw himself into his work, often leaving early and coming home late to avoid facing the emptiness of their home. Emily, meanwhile, struggled to cope. She found it hard to concentrate in school, and simple tasks like eating or sleeping felt like monumental efforts. It was in this fragile state that Linda entered their lives, offering companionship and a chance to rebuild. One evening, Mr. Johnson called Emily into the living room. He sat on the sofa, looking nervous yet hopeful. "Emily," he began, his voice gentle, "I've been thinking. We need someone to help us move forward, someone to bring warmth back into this home." Emily frowned, sensing where the conversation was going. "I've met someone," her father continued, hesitating. "Her name is Linda. She's kind, smart, and I think she can be good for us." Emily nodded slowly. She wanted her father to be happy, but something about this felt too soon. When Linda first moved into the Johnson household, she brought with her an air of charm and grace that seemed to light up the place. She had a way of speaking that made people feel comfortable, and her laughter echoed warmly through the house. Mr. Johnson, weary from the loneliness of being a widower, found himself smiling more often. For Emily, however, Linda's arrival was the beginning of a nightmare. At first, Linda was polite to Emily. She asked about her school, helped her prepare meals, and even bought her new dresses, claiming she wanted to help the family. Emily tried to welcome her stepmother, though she missed her mother deeply, but Linda's kindness didn't last. Once she settled in, her attitude shifted. She began picking on Emily for the smallest things. She criticized everything Emily did, no matter how small. "Emily, why is this floor so dirty?" Linda barked one morning, even though Emily had just cleaned it. "Are you trying to make this house look like a pigsty?" Emily bit her lip and grabbed the mop again, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. Linda also took pleasure in making Emily's chores more difficult. If Emily finished cleaning, Linda would purposely spill water or leave a mess for her to clean up again. She once burned Emily's favorite dress with an iron, claiming it was an accident, but her smirk told a different story. One night, Linda deliberately locked the kitchen cupboard so Emily couldn't eat after a long day at school. "You didn't do the dishes properly yesterday," she said coldly when Emily asked why. "No dinner for you." The psychological abuse was just as damaging. Linda often made cruel remarks about Emily's late mother. "Your mother spoiled you," she sneered one day. "That's why you're so useless now." Linda's criticisms didn't stop there. She began controlling every part of Emily's daily life. If Emily spent too much time studying in her room, Linda would accuse her of avoiding chores. If Emily washed the dishes too slowly, Linda would call her useless. "Do you think life is just about books?" Linda sneered one evening. "Maybe if you spent more time working, you'd actually be good for something." What hurt Emily the most was how Linda twisted her father's perception of her. Linda often complained to Mr. Johnson about Emily, painting her as ungrateful and rebellious. "Johnson," Linda would say in her sweet, innocent voice, "I'm trying my best to guide Emily, but she's so stubborn. She barely listens to me." Mr. Johnson, tired from long hours at his shop, would sigh and glance at Emily. "Emily, you need to respect your stepmother," he said one evening after Linda's complaints. "She's trying to help you." Emily felt her heart sink. "Dad, I didn't do anything wrong," she said softly, but her father didn't seem to hear her. Linda's manipulation grew worse over time. She began subtly driving a wedge between father and daughter. She made sure Mr. Johnson only heard her side of the story. One day, Linda deliberately broke an expensive mirror in the house while Emily was at school. When Emily returned, Linda confronted her in front of her father. "Emily, how could you be so careless?" Linda said, her voice trembling with feigned frustration. "This was one of my favorite mirrors. Your father works so hard, and you just destroy things without a second thought." Emily stared at her in shock. "I didn't break it. I wasn't even here." "Don't lie to me," Linda shot back, her voice rising. She turned to Mr. Johnson. "You see, Johnson? This is what I deal with every day." Mr. Johnson frowned, glancing at Emily. "Emily, you need to be more careful," he said, disappointment in his voice. "But I didn't—" Emily started, but her father raised a hand to stop her. "No more excuses, Emily," he said firmly. Over time, Linda's lies and manipulation began to take their toll. Mr. Johnson started to grow distant from Emily, often siding with Linda in arguments. Emily felt like a stranger in her own home, isolated and unsupported. She missed the days when her father would laugh with her, listen to her stories about school, and encourage her dreams of becoming a teacher. Now he barely looked at her the same way, and Emily felt like she was losing him. The once warm home that Emily had grown up in had become a cold and unkind place. She longed for the day when things would return to normal, but deep down, she feared that Linda's hold on her father might never break. One day, Emily overheard Linda talking on the phone. Linda stood in the kitchen, her back turned, her voice low but clear. "That girl is in my way. Everything her mother left belongs to me now. I just need to figure out how to make her disappear." Emily's hands shook as she stood frozen behind the door. She couldn't believe her ears. Her stepmother, this woman her father trusted, was planning something terrible. But Emily had no proof, and she knew her father wouldn't believe her. That night, Emily sat in her small bedroom, staring at the photo of her late mother on the bedside table. "What do I do, Mama?" she whispered, tears sliding down her face. She felt trapped, with no one to turn to. The once happy home she knew had become a place of fear and unease. A few weeks after Emily overheard Linda's phone conversation, the tension in the house grew worse. Linda had started openly criticizing Emily in front of her father. "Johnson," she said one evening at dinner, "Emily is always late doing her chores. Maybe she thinks I'm her servant." Emily's face burned with anger, but she stayed silent, biting back her words. Her father glanced at her, frowning slightly, but he said nothing. Linda had a way of twisting situations to make herself look like the victim. One evening, something strange happened. Mr. Johnson came home from his shop, looking upset. "Emily," he said sharply, "I need to talk to you." Emily followed him to the living room, where Linda was already sitting, arms crossed and lips pursed. Mr. Johnson opened an empty safe. "This is where I keep the shop's weekly earnings ready to take to the bank. Someone took the money, and I need to know who." Emily's heart raced. "Dad, I don't know anything about it," she said, her voice steady but panicked. Linda leaned forward, her expression calm but her words cutting. "Johnson, I don't want to cause trouble, but Emily has been acting strange lately. She spends a lot of time in her room. Maybe you should check her things." "Linda, I didn't take anything," Emily said, her voice rising. Mr. Johnson sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "Emily, just let me check your room," he said, avoiding her eyes. Reluctantly, Emily led him to her room. Linda followed closely, her arms folded like a spectator at a show. Mr. Johnson opened drawers and searched under the bed. When he lifted a small wooden box from the corner, his face turned pale. Inside was a stack of cash. "Emily," he said slowly, his voice full of disbelief. "How could you do this?" "That's not mine," Emily cried, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't put it there." Linda shook her head, clicking her tongue. "I didn't want to believe it either, Johnson, but the evidence speaks for itself." Mr. Johnson's face darkened with fury. Turning to Emily, he spoke with a voice sharp as a blade. "Is this how you repay me? I've worked tirelessly to provide you with a comfortable life, and you steal from me, trying to ruin my business. You've brought shame to this family." Disappointment clouded his eyes as he delivered his final judgment. "I can't have you in this house anymore." That same night, Emily was thrown out of the house. Emily wandered the streets of Accra with only a small bag of clothes and a few CDs in her pocket. The sky was dark, and the city's usual lively energy felt distant and unfriendly. Emily's heart was heavy with pain, and tears streamed down her face as she walked aimlessly, unsure of where to go. She tried to think of someone who could help her, but her family lived far away, and she hadn't stayed in touch with many friends since Linda came into her life. The streets felt endless, the noise of passing cars and street vendors only adding to her growing fear. By midnight, Emily found herself in Makola Market. The shops were closed, and the once busy market was eerily quiet. She sat on a wooden bench near a row of locked stalls, clutching her bag tightly. The night air was cold, and she shivered as she pulled her thin scarf closer to her body. As hunger gnawed at her stomach, Emily thought about the warm meals her mother used to cook. She remembered the comforting smell of jollof rice and fried plantains, but now even a piece of bread felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The hours dragged on. A group of boys walked past her, laughing loudly. One of them stopped and pointed at her. "What's a girl like you doing here so late?" he asked, his tone mocking. Emily didn't answer, lowering her head to avoid their stares. Thankfully, they moved on, but her heart raced with fear. The next morning, Emily woke up to the sound of traders setting up their stalls. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard bench, and her stomach growled loudly. She dug into her bag and found a few coins, just enough to buy a sachet of water and a small loaf of bread from a nearby vendor. As she ate, she wondered how long she could survive like this. She couldn't go back home. Her father wouldn't believe her, and Linda would only humiliate her again. For the next few days, Emily wandered the streets, trying to find a safe place to rest. She avoided crowded areas, fearing that someone might recognize her and ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. At night, she slept in corners or on benches, covering herself with her scarf to stay warm. One humid afternoon in Makola Market, Emily sat on a dusty bench near the edge of the bustling market. She clutched her small bag of clothes tightly, her stomach growling from hunger. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in days and felt light-headed from exhaustion when she heard her name. "Emily!" The voice startled her. She looked up to see Sarah, her childhood friend, and her mother, Auntie Abina, standing in front of her. Emily blinked in disbelief, her lips parting, but no words coming out. They were surprised to see her in that state and decided to take her home with them. Once inside, Mama Abina guided Emily to a chair. "Sarah, bring her some water," she instructed. Emily sipped the water slowly, her hands still shaking. Mama Abina crouched in front of her, her tone soft but firm. "Now, my child, tell us what has happened. Why are you out here like this?" Emily hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper as she began. She told them everything: how her stepmother Linda had framed her for theft, how her father had thrown her out, and how she had wandered the streets with nowhere to go. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, but Sarah and Mama Abina listened patiently, their expressions shifting from concern to anger. "That wicked woman!" Mama Abina exclaimed when Emily finished. "How can someone be so heartless? Don't worry, Emily. You're safe now. No one will hurt you here." Sarah placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "You're staying with us now," she said firmly. "Mama and I will take care of you, and we'll figure out a way to fix this." From that day, Emily became part of their household. Mama Abena treated her like one of her own, making sure she ate well and had clean clothes to wear. Sarah, always the protective and bold friend, became Emily's biggest advocate, promising to help her find justice. Over the next few weeks, Emily and Sarah tried to figure out what to do. Sarah had an idea. "Let's go to Michael," she said one evening. Michael was a journalist who lived nearby. He was known for exposing liars and criminals in the city. Michael listened carefully as Emily told her story. He nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes in a small notebook. "If Linda framed you, we'll find out," he said with quiet determination. Together they began digging into Linda's past. Michael visited government offices and searched public records. He discovered that Linda had been married twice before and had left both marriages under suspicious circumstances. "Emily," Michael said one afternoon, "this woman has a pattern. She's a master at taking advantage of people. We just need solid proof to expose her." Sarah had her own idea. "What if we get evidence from inside the house? If Linda framed you, she must have left some clues behind." Emily hesitated. "I don't know how we'll do that. My father won't let me back in." Sarah smirked. "Leave that to me." One evening, while Linda and Mr. Johnson were out, Sarah slipped into the house. Using a small camera Michael had given her, she planted it discreetly in the living room. They hoped it would catch Linda in one of her schemes. The wait was agonizing, but their determination grew stronger with each passing day. Emily's hope slowly returned as she realized she wasn't alone in her fight for justice. A week after Sarah planted the hidden camera, Emily, Sarah and Michael gathered in Michael's small apartment. The footage from the camera had been recorded and was ready to watch. Emily's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of the chair, her heart pounding. This was her only chance to clear her name and expose Linda for the liar she was. Michael pressed play, and the three leaned closer to the screen. The video showed Linda pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. "That girl?" Linda's voice was sharp. "She's out of the house now. It was easy. I put the money in her room myself. Johnson believed me without a second thought." She laughed, a cruel sound that echoed in the quiet room. "I'll get the rest of what's mine soon enough." Emily felt a mix of relief and anger rise in her chest. Sarah clenched her fists, her eyes blazing with fury. "She admitted it. She framed you, Emily." Michael paused the video and looked at Emily. "This is the proof we need. But we'll need more to bring her down completely. Let's see what else she's been hiding." Over the next few days, Michael continued his investigation into Linda's past. He managed to track down one of her ex-husbands, a man named George who lived in Kumasi. George shared a similar story. Linda had charmed her way into his life, then manipulated him and drained his finances before disappearing. "She's a snake," George said bitterly over the phone. "If she's doing it to someone else now, she needs to be stopped." With George's testimony and the video evidence, Michael, Emily and Sarah felt ready to confront Linda. Emily was nervous but determined. "I need my father to see the truth," she said. The confrontation happened one evening when Mr. Johnson returned home from work. Emily, Sarah, and Michael arrived at the house together. Mr. Johnson was surprised to see them. "Emily, what are you doing here?" he asked, his tone guarded. "Dad," Emily said softly, holding up a USB drive, "I have something you need to see." Linda, who had been sitting on the sofa, stiffened when she saw them. "What is this about?" she asked sharply. Michael plugged the USB drive into the TV and played the video. As Linda's voice filled the room, Mr. Johnson's face turned pale. He watched in stunned silence as Linda admitted to framing Emily. When the video ended, Linda tried to recover. "This is fake. They're trying to ruin me," she shouted. Michael stepped forward. "It's not fake, and we've spoken to one of your ex-husbands. He told us everything about how you've done this before." Mr. Johnson turned to Linda, his voice shaking. "Is this true, Linda? Did you frame Emily?" Linda faltered, then dropped her act. "What does it matter? She doesn't deserve anything. I worked hard to take care of this family." "You didn't take care of us," Mr. Johnson said, his voice rising. "You lied. You broke this family apart." Linda's confidence crumbled as Mr. Johnson's anger grew. "You're leaving this house tonight. I trusted you, and you betrayed me," he said firmly. Emily stood silently, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in months, her father looked at her with regret and understanding. "Emily," he said softly, "I'm so sorry. I didn't believe you when I should have." Linda grabbed her purse and stormed out, but not before turning to Emily with a venomous glare. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but Emily stood tall, no longer afraid. That night, Emily finally felt the weight of her stepmother's lies lift from her shoulders. The truth had come out, and justice was on her side. After Linda stormed out of the house, the air felt lighter, but the damage she had caused lingered. Mr. Johnson sat quietly in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. Emily and Sarah sat across from him, unsure of what to say. The man who had once been so confident now looked small, defeated by his own poor judgment. "Emily," Mr. Johnson finally said, his voice heavy, "I don't know how I let this happen. I should have believed you. I was blinded by her lies." Emily looked at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "Dad, I was hurt, but I understand. She fooled everyone, not just you." Sarah, ever the bold one, chimed in. "Mr. Johnson, Linda was a professional liar. Don't beat yourself up too much. The important thing is that Emily's name is cleared now." Mr. Johnson nodded slowly. "Thank you, Sarah. And you too, Michael," he said, turning to the journalist. "If you hadn't helped us, I don't know how we'd have exposed her." Michael, who had been quietly observing, gave a small smile. "Justice is important, but the real credit goes to Emily. She didn't give up, even when everything seemed against her." The days that followed were a mix of healing and rebuilding. Emily moved back into her father's house, but things didn't go back to normal immediately. The trust between them had been shaken, and they both had to work to repair it. Meanwhile, Linda's downfall became the talk of the neighborhood. Word spread quickly about how she had manipulated Mr. Johnson and framed Emily. People whispered about her as they passed by, and her reputation crumbled. Linda tried to stay in the city, but the shame was too much. A few weeks later, she packed her things and left Accra without saying a word. One day, Michael stopped by the house with exciting news. "The article is out," he said, handing Emily a copy of the local newspaper. The headline read, "Con Artist Exposed, Woman's Scheme to Frame Stepdaughter Unveiled." Emily's face lit up as she read the article. It detailed Linda's past crimes, how she had framed Emily, and how justice had finally prevailed. "You're a hero now," Sarah teased, nudging Emily. Emily laughed softly. "Not a hero. I just wanted my truth to be heard." The article brought closure not just to Emily but to others who had suffered under Linda's schemes. One of her ex-husbands even reached out to Michael, thanking him for exposing her. Slowly but surely, life returned to normal. Emily focused on her studies again, determined to achieve her dream of becoming a teacher. She and her father spent more time together, repairing their bond over shared meals and conversations about the future. Though the scars of Linda's betrayal remained, Emily found strength in the support of her friends and her father's efforts to make amends. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful about what was to come. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more great content. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know what you think. And don't forget to share this video with someone who might enjoy it too. See you in the next one.